Today we will learn about the two most common approaches to ethical method. This helps us learn ethics because when we encounter moral arguments, if we want to understand them well, we will want to be able to trace a speaker's way of thinking. If we have a sense of the most common approaches to moral argument, this will be easier. In addition, understanding ethical method helps us understand some of the reasons for people's moral disagreements. What is an ethical method? It is a generic way of understanding right and wrong. A moral method also describes a way a person can develop an argument to support a moral claim. Or more simply, you could say a moral method is a way of doing ethics. When we learned about moral claims, we heard that a moral claim has three parts: the diagnosis, what's right or wrong, the prognosis, how to respond to this, and the basis or rationale, the reasoning and values that support our claim. Moral method focuses on the basis or rationale for a moral claim. There are a lot of different ethical methods. Some of them are well known, like human rights. You've probably heard about some of them, like virtue ethics or universal moral law. And there are probably a few you've never heard of, like casuistry. Just because you go to a Jesuit school, a quick note about casuistry. In the 17th century in Europe, Jesuits were associated with casuistry. People who were not fans of casuistry, and some people who are not fans of Jesuits, say the Jesuits abused casuistry by making it seem like you could do almost anything you wanted, as long as you could come up with an excuse for it. The most famous person to make this criticism is Blaise Pascal, the same guy you're going to learn about in math classes. Among these approaches to doing ethics, the two most common are deontology and teleology. These may be new terms for you, and students sometimes get caught up on the terminology. So to start with, let's focus on the style of argument they each use. Teleology focuses on outcomes. This approach names a goal or outcome as a rationale or basis for the moral claim. Deontology focuses on actions. This approach says that these actions are valuable for their own sake, all by themselves. So the rationale for the action is going to point out a value of the action itself. This is a list of moral claims. Let's look at one of them. Drive the speed limit because it's the law. When we look for the three parts of the moral claim, we're only going to find two of them here. Drive the speed limit, that's what they're asking us to do, and because it's the law. That's the rationale for what they're asking us to do. The diagnosis, what's wrong here, is not explicitly mentioned, though it is kind of implied. It would seem that someone has not been driving the speed limit. By writing the claim this way, the author focuses our attention on what they want us to do and why they want that. That's the case for all of the claims on this slide. They're going to name an action and rationale or basis for it. Here, I've highlighted the rationale or basis given for each of these moral claims. You might want to take a screenshot, import it into Notability, and write next to each claim whether you think its rationale names a goal, or if its rationale points back to a valued trait of the action itself. After that, continue this video to check your work. If you have a question about any of the claims, there is a separate video that talks through each claim. So take a screenshot and do some thinking. The next screen will take these moral claims and sort them by method. On the left, I have listed the moral claims with a basis or rationale that looks back at the value of the action itself, and on the right, the basis of the claim names a goal. You might want to pause the video here to see if you identified each claim correctly. We've spent some time working on learning the patterns of these two moral methods. Now let's work on the vocabulary. The moral method that presents an action as valuable itself is called deontology. The Greek root for the term is deon, which means duty. It holds that we have an ethical duty to do something simply because of the value of the action itself. The moral method that supports a claim by naming an outcome or a goal is called teleology. The Greek root for the term is telos, which means goal. When you watch the Professor Michael Sandel video, if you keep on watching past the assigned segment, you'll run into the terms categorical and consequentialist. These are largely synonymous with the terms deontology and teleology. Deontology and teleology each name a generic way of understanding right and wrong, but within each of these methods, we find a number of different theories about how to think about right and wrong. For example, it is very common for deontological approaches to focus on moral laws or rules. But cultural conservatism often also takes a deontological approach, and these two ways of doing ethics can reach very different conclusions. People using the same ethical method often end up disagreeing with each other. Among the teleological approaches, 3 are very well known. You may have heard of Machiavelli, the political philosopher. When he gives advice to Prince Lorenzo de' Medici, he argues that the ends justify the means. The ends, or the goal he has in mind, is social or political stability. So whatever the prince does to maintain political stability is justified. Another well-known approach to ethics is utilitarianism. These 2 sentences reference 2 different utilitarian theories. Also among the teleological approaches, there is virtue ethics. This way of doing ethics focuses on cultivating the virtue of the person doing the action. This makes it different from the other teleological approaches because the goal is internal to the person. The other teleological approaches have goals that benefit others. Understanding moral method helps us interpret ethical arguments. Close reading moral arguments is a skill that takes some practice. You will find some sample moral arguments on Canvas so you can practice this skill. Simply look for the 3 parts of a moral claim: diagnosis, prognosis, and basis. Remember, one or more of the parts of a moral claim can be implied. The author may not say it explicitly. It might be hard to find a clean quote in the argument for that part of the claim. After you identify the rationale or basis for the claim, note whether it is deontological or teleological. What moral method should I use? That's a question everybody should answer for themselves. Some people have a commitment to a particular moral method. But most people move back and forth between methods because they find they fit better with the kind of ethical guidance they consider most appropriate for the challenges they face. Here are 3 things that can make a difference for a person's choice of ethical method. Sometimes context makes a difference for a choice. Some students think of ethics about telling them what to do, so they resist any ethical theory that challenges them. This is not what we're doing when we choose an ethical method. Ethics is about being true to ourselves and being decent to others, so we want to find an ethical method that does some moral work for us, one that challenges us to think about the most important values in a situation. For example, people often turn to deontological ethics when setting boundaries and for respecting and protecting people. This is especially true if great harm could come to a person when moral standards are not followed. Deontology is a common approach for medical ethics, and in international laws of war, we use a deontological approach. Teleological ethics is commonly used to guide moral education and for public policy, like public health. When you look at the video by Professor Michael Sandel, The Moral Side of Murder, you see his students move back and forth from one moral method to another. When it comes to protecting a person from harm, the majority of students favor a deontological approach. When it comes to making a bad situation incrementally better, the majority of students take a teleological approach. A person's religious beliefs sometimes point to a moral method. People who see God as a ruler or king might be more likely to take a legalistic or deontological approach to ethics. People who see God as an inner light might be more likely to choose virtue ethics and see the moral life as an effort to become more godlike. Sometimes we choose a moral method that fits with our stance. If our first step in the moral life is about constraining evil, preventing harm, or protecting the vulnerable, our next step is more likely to be deontological. If our first step in the moral life is about encouraging progress on a social issue, striving for excellence, or being open to growth, our next step is more likely to be teleological. In summary, a moral claim has three parts: a diagnosis, what's right or wrong; a prognosis, how to respond or what to do about it; and a rationale or basis for the claim. A moral method is part of the rationale or basis for the moral claim. It names a way of building an argument to support that moral claim. Though there are a lot of ethical methods, the two most common are deontology and teleology. Deontological claims offer a basis for the moral action that highlights the action's own value. Teleological claims offer a basis for a moral claim by naming a valued goal for the action. Most people choose moral methodologies that fit well with the challenges of a situation. Other reasons for choosing one method over another include religious beliefs or a person's moral stance.